Good evening, Kansas City. Thank you for tuning in to our part two of our Restore KC public program. My name is Paul Gutierrez, Director of Programs and Events at the Kansas City Museum. Tonight, we're again live from the second floor education room. So one day, you guys will come in here and learn more about what's happening with the museum as far as school groups and curriculum and field trips. I want to remind our audience that part one of this Restore KC program is on our website at kansascitymuseum.org. That's kansascitymuseum.org, and also on our Facebook page, which is just under Kansas City Museum. This evening, I want to welcome back Tracy and Sydney. Good evening, ladies.
Hi, Paul.
Good evening. Glad to be back.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for coming back on. It's been a week ago. So if you want to give audience just a recap of what we discussed last week, and then you can jump into your part two of your program.
Sure. Did you want to start, Sydney, or do you want me to?
I'll go ahead and start this time. Again, thank you all who are tuning in for this. We really appreciate your presence and your interest in what we're going to talk about in terms of mindfulness and how mindfulness can be helpful in terms of healing ourselves and healing communities. So I am Sydney Spears, and I identify as a cisgendered woman of color, Black, cisgendered, multiracial. And I work as a part-time professor at University of Kansas. I also work as a mindfulness teacher for Midwest Alliance for Mindfulness that's here in the Kansas City area. And then I also work as a part-time psychotherapist, specializing in working with people who are survivors of trauma, as well as people who have been struggling with certain identities or maybe intersections of identities in terms of social cultural identity too. So we talked last time about how mindfulness may be helpful for us, especially during these difficult times in terms of our inner healing, in terms of our inner awareness and our inner healing. And we talked about what is mindfulness. So Tracy and I both shared what we thought about mindfulness. So I'll start off with that part to just kind of give a brief recap, and then I'll turn it over to Tracy so that she can also share her perceptions about mindfulness. But I had mentioned that I always found it helpful to explain mindfulness for people who don't understand what that means, or maybe you heard the language, but you weren't sure what it was about, is that it's kind of like a self-study. If you don't know something, we tend to go out and we find out. We get education about it. We go to school about it. We take classes around that particular subject or topic. And so mindfulness is actually an invitation for us to kind of turn inward, to examine ourselves and just notice what comes up for us in terms of what we're thinking, what we're feeling, emotions, where we may feel some of those emotions in our bodies, how our bodies actually feel, what we may be sensing in our bodies, because all of those factors, thinking, feeling, being, sensing, they're all interconnected. So it actually gives us more information about what we're experiencing, especially in present moments. And if we can bring some non-judgment to that, kind of have a neutral way of noticing what we're experiencing, be that our own inner experience or be that our responses to what's happening in the external world. If we can bring more non-judgment to that, bring that neutrality to it, then we're better able to kind of hold that and really be able to be a little bit more curious about it, so we can learn, like, I didn't know that I was reacting this way until I kind of tuned in and I started to notice my habit, rather than just kind of being caught off in our minds. But this is the invitation to be kind of whole body in our experience. So that's kind of my brief explanation of mindfulness. And I'll turn it over to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Sydney.
Hey, Tracy.
Yes.
Before I slide off, I want to just let the audience know that if they have any comments or questions, just add them in the Dropbox below, and I will slide back in to answer those questions, and also let the audience know that this program is being recorded.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
So I'm Tracy Ochester, and I'm a cisgender, white identifying, multiracial woman, and I'm a psychologist in private practice in Kansas City, and also I'm the Heart Mind Coordinator for the Midwest Alliance for Mindfulness. And I think Sydney gave a very thorough and wonderful definition of mindfulness. I like to say it's a way of living. It's a way of showing up in the world where we're more present and we're seeing the world through a clearer lens that isn't quite as colored by our preconceived notions, our biases about the world. We're able to see things, as Sydney said, in a little bit more of an objective way so that we can respond with wisdom, so that we can respond in a skillful way to whatever arises.
Yeah, and we also talked about how learning and practicing mindfulness can be helpful to many of us, especially in these difficult times, in terms of what we may be experiencing in response to these difficult times, but also in response to just our daily lives. As Tracy mentioned, that it really is about perhaps gaining this skill through our practice of life, because life is always the teacher out there. We're always experiencing something, whether it is pleasant or not pleasant, or whether it's neutral. So I felt as though mindfulness, and I even shared a bit about my own experience around mindfulness and how it's been helpful to me, especially since we're talking about racialized trauma and social injustices and so on. And I certainly have had my share of those experiences for sure. And for me in particular, it has been very, very helpful in terms of helping me slow down and pause and notice what I am really experiencing, especially when there were experiences, personal experiences of having some things said to me that were not very kind, and they were based from my race in particular, my racial identity. Even some things that have been done in organizations in terms of my work in organizations, various organizations. We call those microaggressions. And so in terms of really navigating those, instead of just like I used to get just so angry, so caught up in that I couldn't even think clearly. And I would just ruminate on it, go over and over and over and over. And so I'd end up feeling just really, really depleted, as a matter of fact. But it didn't really help me. It didn't help me think about and reflect upon what did I need, or what do I really need to do, or, what are those feelings and that sense of that anger and that frustration. What might be the message in that? If I could sit with that a little longer, kind of slow down instead of getting so caught up in it, or either ignoring it at times, that's the mindfulness piece of bringing in that attention and awareness to what I was experiencing, but also being able to bring in that curiosity and that reflection, that slowing down to really, really reflect of like, okay, so what does this really mean to me? What is it that I might need? So it would generate questions like that, which is really self-compassion in many ways. And therefore, it was very helpful in terms of me being less caught up, less tight in my body, less tight in my mind, and it allowed more clarity of my thinking and even my feeling, to be able to identify what I was feeling and identify the emotions that came up. So it gave me a lot more clarity. So I was better able to be more kind and sensitive to myself, rather than ruminating and ending up beating myself up, but really not coming to any sense of, so what can I do with this? What does this mean?
Sydney, it sounds like something that always comes to mind when I'm reflecting on the benefits of my mindfulness practice, and that is that it makes us more responsive than reactive.
Yeah.
Responsive to ourselves, responsive to the situation, rather than just having these really impulsive types of reactions that aren't always effective for us, that can wind up making us suffer even more.
Exactly. And that word that you use, Tracy, suffering. I mean, it's like self-inflicted suffering. At least it was for me when I got really caught up into it, ruminating for, the next 2 days, the next week, telling other people. Now, it doesn't mean that I didn't have those thoughts, but how can I hold those thoughts? And yes, they're painful. So I'm admitting and accepting the pain. But there's a difference between accepting the pain and when you mention suffering, because suffering takes that to another level. Where when we start to go into the suffering lane, and notice what I said, I was experiencing some self-inflicted suffering. When I go into that lane, then it means, again, it cuts off my thought. It cuts off my own possible internal wisdom, because my mind is spinning so fast. I'm so saturated into the emotions, and that's what creates more suffering. My blood pressure can go up. My heart rate can go up. It can be really unhealthy for me in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I think that mindfulness has been such a gift in that way. And you're talking about the pain that comes at us that's uncontrollable from the outside world, like other people and circumstances that we're in. And then there's this other layer of suffering that we can compound ourselves by the way we react to the situation. And mindfulness helps us make a space there so that maybe we don't add that additional layer of suffering on top of the situation. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if it might make sense to do a little brief mindfulness practice to kind of allow our listeners and ourselves to really arrive before we launch into some of our thoughts on how mindfulness might resource us for the outer work of racial justice.
That would be great.
Sound okay? Okay.
Sounds good.
So let's start by just taking some sort of posture that allows you to be alert and awake and aware, that allows your body to be reasonably comfortable. And you might decide to lower your gaze, find a soft gazing point, or you might close your eyes. And I'm going to invite you to think of a word or a phrase that represents something that you aspire to strengthen and embody more in the world. A word or a phrase that describes some beneficial quality that you'd like to bring even more into the world. And it might be something like courage or strength. It might be peace or listening or fairness. It might be a bunch of things that bubble up for you, but maybe seeing if you can just pick one of them for now. And once you've settled on your phrase, beginning to bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting here. Just tucking that phrase into the back of your mind as you notice your posture, your stillness, maybe the feeling of yourself breathing. Just noticing what's alive in you for a few moments. And now coming back to your chosen words, and each time you breathe in, repeating them to yourself silently. And really seeing if you can explore the meaning of the word, not just the idea of it, but how it feels to you from your own embodied experience. What's it like to live into these words? And maybe even imagining that as you're breathing in, you're inhaling the very essence, the spirit of these words, letting them fill you up. And then repeating your words one last time. And as you breathe them in, imagining their qualities filling every part of you. Maybe even expanding out beyond you to others. Sharing these benefits with people that are near and far. And then on your next exhale, just letting your words fade into the background. And returning your attention to your body sitting here. Maybe beginning to notice the sounds and the space around you. Maybe starting to lift your gaze, reorient yourself to your space, to the screen in front of you. And as we transition back into our talk, you might want to take a little stretch or get a sip of your drink. And that was a little taste, a little experience of a sort of contemplative meditation practice. Help you get in touch with what really matters to you most.
Thank you, Tracy, for sharing that. I think that particular experience, mindfulness experience, really did resonate in terms of the practice of helping us slow down and where's our attention, noticing where our attention is and notice what we're focusing on. As you mentioned, that particular word that could be an object of attention and focus. And in this case, too, bringing in the invitation to focus on something that may have been meaningful for us as well. Yeah. So thank you. very much for sharing that. You know, for this segment, for part 2, this is about mindfulness as well, but adding on how mindfulness may be useful in helping us do some of the outer work or social justice-based work that we could choose to do, because social justice work certainly is not easy at all. It is quite challenging, especially if we truly have that value for social justice, and we truly stay committed and dedicated to it. And that can be difficult too, keeping that dedication going. But I was just wondering, Tracy, if you had any thoughts about how mindfulness may be helpful in advocacy, allyship, social justice.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about a little bit about what we talked about last time. You really kindly shared some of your experiences of trauma as a person of color in a racialized culture. And I think when you commit to doing social justice work, probably especially as a person of color, not only are you dealing every day with the usual ordinary re-traumatization that you experience day after day, but also you're deliberately putting yourself into situations where that trauma is likely to happen again and again and again. And even as a white identifying person, to show up over and over in spaces where you feel a lot of pushback, maybe even some violence, a lot of resentment, maybe even cruelty toward the hard work that you're trying to do, and also the disappointments that happen over and over when things don't quite turn out the way that you hoped, and that your hard work doesn't seem to be making a difference. As you mentioned, that it's not only challenging, but it's a long-term proposition. It's something that you have to make sustainable. And I think mindfulness can help us in all those layers. I think first and foremost, beginning to work with our own trauma and responding to re-traumatization. What do you think about that, Sydney?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, that certainly has been part of how mindfulness has been helpful for me with my experience, my racialized experience since really I was born. And in particular, when you mentioned the trauma, because of course, when I was a kid or adolescent, I wasn't really thinking of that as trauma. But as I got older, and especially with a lot of my studies in diversity, equity, inclusion, and my own experience, and then teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion, I started to find out that actually I had been experiencing lots of different layers of trauma. And in particular, ones that we don't always think about, or many people don't think about. They might think about that interpersonal trauma, but trauma in terms of the experience of the historical trauma. And in my case, for people who are Black or African American, and that history of enslavement, that even though that was a long time ago, in a way, it wasn't really that long ago, if that makes sense. But that is passed down. Those narratives are passed down. And, there's even some research to indicate that there's some epigenetics that are going on, that it's passed down within genes, because it's trauma, it's unhealed trauma, historical collective trauma. And when trauma of any kind is not healed, then it has a tendency, of course, to continue on in the next generation if we don't stop and really look at this and heal it. And so that was one of my experiences. And that was kind of an awakening for me, not only just, day to day racialized injustice that I've experienced throughout my life, like microaggressions, and also systemically in many ways, but carrying also this big layer of this historical collective trauma, Tracy, um, and even some degrees of community trauma. And there are some of us who carry a lot of community trauma as we speak that has never been healed or reconciled or gotten the resources and gotten their needs met in terms of changing that from a traumatic community to a more healing, viable community and an empowerment-based community.
I was thinking about how the communities that you're working with when you're doing social justice work are often traumatized, and the institutions that you're working within. I know, Sydney, that you've worked a little bit in the school systems, and some of the school systems are traumatized systems, and so you're carrying your own trauma into the situation as well as meeting other people's trauma. And mindfulness, I think, really helps us start to be aware of the very human reactions that happen when we're experiencing trauma, especially maybe around the central nervous system, the way that our bodies can have really automatic reactions that can make it hard for us to think clearly and respond wisely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That those automatic habits and patterns we can get into on all those levels, in the community, the ones that are embedded within our institutions, and even for some of us witnessing what's going on in the United States right now in terms of institutions. Oh my goodness, yeah. Um, and how that is traumatizing or re-traumatizing in many ways. But to be able to bring more compassion, I think that's the one of the bigger pieces too for me that has been helpful in dealing with my own layers of trauma and helping other people who have dealt with layers of trauma. That mindfulness is so based in compassion. And I just think when I look at the world now, Tracy, I just think, oh my God, that's exactly to me what we need. And what has been helpful to me, self-compassion, to turn that compassion toward myself, and then also to bring compassion and express compassion really deeply from really neck down. I feel like it's a soul kind of it's a feeling more than a thought. It's within my soul to bring that to myself and then bring that to other people who are suffering and who are underserved.
Hey, Sydney.
Mhm.
Speaking of compassion, that was my word that I was reflecting on when we had this fall a meditation that Tracy led. That was the word that I focused on during my minute with her.
Nice. Nice. Very nice. Yeah. Um, the Latin root of the word compassion is with suffering. So can we be with our suffering when it does arise, and how mindfulness can help us and almost like be this container in many ways to support being with our own suffering, pain, and then being with the suffering of other people, especially if we are really invested in or if we have the desire to help other people or other communities that have been underserved, that have dealt with light years of injustice, disparities, barriers to having access to services that they really, really need. in the hierarchy of needs, being on the bottom and been on the bottom for a long, 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 long time. But how compassion and mindfulness can help us navigate that course, because it certainly is not easy, again, when we really have that deep desire, or if we're doing social justice work like advocacy, if we really truly want to be an ally, that we always have to start at home with ourselves, I feel like. But once we do our work, then we are better able to bring compassion to other people in communities that have been underserved, from what I said, the neck down. And that is authentic advocacy, allyship, activism. That is authentic. And how mindfulness can help us reflect in terms of how we might take our values and our needs and convert those into that deep sense of compassion.
Sydney, I was thinking that our current political situation is such a great example of the importance of compassion, because when we're really frustrated about, understandably so, about people who have different ideas than we have, and maybe doing things that are harmful, it's easy for us to really find hatred starting to grow in our hearts, especially if you're the one being harmed, right? And the danger of that, though it's understandable, the danger of that is that then your reaction is only perpetuating the very thing that you're trying to change. And we can do that and be totally unaware of it and feel totally justified in it. And I think mindfulness and the practice of compassion can help us hold on to that sense of humanity, of common humanity, even amidst disagreement, even in the face of harm, so that the wise responses that we make are actually truly in alignment with our values and not perpetuating the pain and suffering that we're receiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh my goodness, when you said not perpetuating just what we don't want, that really resonated with me, because I feel like that is so true. And that's one of the things that mindfulness can help us with when we're starting to do what you just said, when we do just go ahead and get caught up, and then we become what we don't want to be. Yeah. We become what these people that are causing harm and re-traumatizing, we can emulate them. And so that is not helping us. That is not helping us at all. And if you have any thoughts around, because when you talked about common humanity, if you have any thoughts around common humanity and its sense of, at least to me, it's about also remembering our connection and interconnection as human beings. Yes, we have differences, and those differences need to be honored. But we sometimes forget that at the end of the day, we all are human, and we all have the same basic needs. But some of us, because of disparities, have other needs as well. But we forget about I feel like the reality that we are truly interconnected. But I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around that, Tracy.
Yeah, I think that my mindfulness practice has helped me understand, just like you mentioned, on a neck down level, how interconnected we are with each other, with the planet, how our actions ripple out and affect others, and then boomerang right back around to impact us. And it's interesting because we're roommates. We're roommates for our entire lives on this planet on which we depend for survival. And my neighbor can't be suffering horribly and that not have an impact on me, right? So when we harm others, ultimately, even though we might not realize it in the moment, we're harming ourselves. If huge swaths of humanity are struggling, we can't truly be happy, no matter how much power or money we might have. The COVID-19 is a great example of that, right? No amount of power and money is going to ultimately prevent you from not only infection, but also all the other side effects of people around you dying and becoming ill. That there's ripple effects. Even just trying to get a doctor's appointment right now is really hard. So even if you are somehow insulated from, other people or the virus itself, there are side effects of this happening around the world that are going to eventually impact you. Absolutely. Mindfulness to me really helps us see that more clearly.
Yeah. I was curious to know, what are your thoughts too about, when you were talking about that, the common humanity piece, but for those people who may really want to keep things divided, especially in our world right now, because some of those people think, oh, well, I'm holding on to power, or it's us versus them, and they're totally fine with that. But I was curious to know if you had any thoughts about how that might be harmful for them too. They may think, hey, it's better to stay divided because it's those people over there, and those people over there are the bad people, the people that are problematic. I'm totally fine. But do you have any thoughts about that type of divisiveness, and how that could harm certain people who feel that way?
Yeah. I mean, just like we talked about last time, it's dehumanizing, right? We're disconnected from the human experience and our natural affinity for compassion and altruism. But also, there's all kinds of experience and treasure that we're missing out on when we limit our contact to just certain kinds of people or certain places or certain experiences, right? There's a whole bunch of creativity that we're missing out on and ideas that we're missing out on. And there's actually, it's not just a concept, there's some good research, right, in the business world about how more diverse organizations have a lot more creativity and success. And also we have some good research that says that in communities where there's a lot of difference in wealth, where there's a kind of like it is in the United States, where there's a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, the well-being of the haves is also less than in countries that don't have that much of a gap. So even the haves are not protected from their, building walls and segregating themselves. Basically, it also reaches them because of this deep interconnection that we all share.
Yeah.
Is that your thought on it too?
Yes, definitely. I think it's definitely a big missed opportunity. And with the history of the United States being entrenched in, at least racially, overall, I'm not saying that there aren't pockets where there is interconnection in certain communities, but most of them, especially in, even rural and urban areas, this lack of proximity to one another and intentional dividing oneself, especially many people, not all, but many people who are white, to live in communities where they are separate from many people of color. And like I said, doing that in this intentional way, so there's not any proximity with bringing people together. They may be able at times to come into the communities if they want to, and many don't, but they can leave. And especially when I think about many communities of color who are experiencing poverty, low income, they can easily in the history of our country, that because of all the disparities, that because of the lack of opportunity, because of the injustice, because of the policies, the rules and regs, because of the government, the institution that really has, to me, kept them there, um, they are not able to have this sense of true interconnection on either side. And I feel like that is what we are also missing. We are missing helping some of the people, especially when we add the economic injustice part to race. We really need to help those people. And I mean intentionally help those people, not just put band-aids on services, but for all of us to get in there and help them be able to thrive and live and have those opportunities that they have missed. And also for the people who have been on the outside and afraid to go in or won't go in, they need to learn and bring in more proximity. Because there's a lot that they're missing too, and how that can be held in fear for a lot of people. Like, I'm not going into that neighborhood. That's a bad, what is a bad neighborhood when most people say that in the United States of America? Who is in that neighborhood when most people say that? So the biases that run through that too. But again, these are things that mindfulness can be helpful with, because mindfulness is all about, just like in that practice that you shared with us in the beginning, some people might think, well, yeah, okay, it was focusing on the word, but it's really training our attention and our awareness, and it's giving us that information about ourselves. Was it hard to focus? Was it easy to focus? Did you come up with a word? Did you not come up with a word? Without judgment. But it's a way of helping us tune in to ourselves again, so we can see, oh, I really am holding some potential bias here. I'm saying I'm not going into that neighborhood for this reason, but maybe it's a much deeper bias. And coming to that ability over time to hold the truth of what we're experiencing too, especially when you take the judgment off of it. But I'm just saying that I feel like mindfulness can be helpful for us in terms of really looking at the hard stuff that we don't want to look at,
Yeah.
or wanting to deny certain things. And it can bring us to more clarity about who we are, who our values are, what our biases are, because we all have biases. And if we really want to do social justice work or advocacy, if we want to help people who are experiencing deep economic injustice or deep environmental injustice, as well as being racialized, and of course gender plays into that as well, then the more that we can inform ourselves about these things and do our own work, the more clarity we're going to have about others. And we can also be more open to what those communities really need than coming in, especially if we have power for certain identities, coming in and thinking, oh, I know what you need. I don't even need to ask you. I know what you need. Well, if you have done some of your work, then we'll learn, especially mindfulness can help with that. Where is our power? I have power with these certain identities. So if I'm going to help this community, maybe I need to pull back some of this power and open up this particular space or conversation with these people in this neighborhood or this individual, so that their voice can come in and pull mine down.
Sydney, I'm so glad that you mentioned that mindfulness can help us be willing to look at the hard stuff, because I think as a white identifying person and a person with privilege, that I don't have to look at a lot of the hard stuff. And it reminds me of when you and I went to do the mindfulness program in the prison.
Yeah.
Remember that? And how I think that a lot of white people kind of don't really think about that, and what happens to people and what happens after people come out of prison. And how people that we lock away for years and years and years with very little rehabilitation, with excessive harm, extra harm done to them, and then when they're time has been served. They're back out in the community with very few resources, having missed years of technology and relationships with their families, and now they're back in the community with very few resources to support them, and how that impacts us all. But mindfulness requires you to open your eyes and to look at things, the good and the bad, and it resources you to be able to do that as well. You're better able to look at those things and be with them, be with the suffering in the world, so that you might have a chance to make a difference, whether that's changing your own behavior or whether that's doing activism out in the world where you're changing laws and regulations and going into institutions. Mindfulness can be a true resource for you in that process.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, we've had some weighty discussion here. If it might be good to do a little practice before question and answer.
I think that would be a good idea. And I am certainly welcome to provide a brief mindfulness practice. If you are interested in participating in this, and if you are, you're welcome to bring your body to a particular posture that is most comfortable for you. And you're also welcome to close your eyes. You might drop your gaze downward if you want to. Or if you need to open your eyes, keep your eyes open. Feel free to do that as well. And maybe just bringing in a few deep breaths. And possibly noticing what it feels like in this present moment to breathe, just to breathe. Breath that could be this expression of your aliveness in this moment. As we breathe together, noticing the sensations of sitting, the points of contact with this earth that we all share. Every human that's ever lived has lived their lives on this very earth. As we breathe this air together, without which we could not survive, recognize we all depend upon a quality of air that is healthy enough for us to breathe. That we are truly interdependent in this way. And feel free to name any body sensations, maybe the quality of your thought or emotions as they arise. And then come back to your breath with compassion and kindness. recognizing these times are difficult in so many different ways for each of us. Maybe connecting in with a compassionate holding of your experience. Noticing what is safe, well, or at ease within you right now, even as you may acknowledge some struggles or difficulty. It might help to put yourself in a place or with a particular being that has helped you feel supported, connected, loved, and grounding ourselves in that embodied experience of being nurtured. Maybe letting that feeling expand throughout you from the soles of your feet to the crown of your head. Expanding the sense of what is well within you to encompass your whole self. Maybe even extending this sense of well-being beyond yourself toward others who may be suffering greatly. The wish for well-being you carry for yourself, extending it beyond your immediate circle out into the world. To all communities who suffer, especially those who are particularly vulnerable. Cultivating a wish to alleviate the suffering that is in our midst right now. May we create systems that support all of us in being alive, thriving, liberated, and most of all, free. So if you want to, we're ending our brief mindfulness practice here. And you might just pause for maybe 10 seconds to just notice what that particular practice was like for you. What did you feel? Any emotions? Did you feel something in your body or something else? Just for a few moments here. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sydney,
Yes.
thank you so much for guiding us through that mindfulness exercise. I just feel just very relaxed, and I hope our audience feels too. Um, we have about 5 minutes left in our program. I want to give you the chance. Any other comments or thoughts from you or Tracy before we close this Restore KC program?
Tracy, I'll let you go first.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that lovely meditation. I'm still kind of marinating in it right now. But yeah, I hope that people will feel curious maybe about this practice of mindfulness and how it might help them be able to face some of the difficulties that we're certainly experiencing even today, and all the ambiguity that's happening in our country, and that you might see for yourself um, how it can be useful, if it can be useful, and how it can be useful. And for those of you that are already out there doing the good work of social justice work, I hope that you might have mindfulness as a tool in your toolbox to help you continue to do that good work, so that you won't burn out, and so that you can continue to benefit us for the long term.
Yeah. And I would just like to share that I always think back to Martin Luther King, and speaking of social justice in terms of, oh my gosh, all of his work. And at the end of the day, he was all about nonviolence, even in social justice work. And to think about all of what he went through, as well as many, many, many other leaders that also worked back in the 60s and the 70s for civil rights. And, you know, lives were taken, lives were threatened, um, incarceration. I mean, it was just a lot. Thinking of the freedom riders who rode the bus, and those freedom riders were across racial lines. It was mixed. It was a mixed group. Um, but they had this deep sense of courage and conviction that they could change their world. And they had so much courage and passion about it that it was like, yeah, I know I'm in danger if I do this, but this is worth it, because I don't want to keep passing this on from generation to generation to generation. So I just wanted to say that I always think back, when it comes to social justice work that I'm doing, I think back to MLK and other leaders too, of that nonviolence, and how nonviolence is so connected to compassion, and how compassion is so connected to mindfulness, and how it was used for some huge changes, huge social changes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Tracy, for sharing some thoughts on mindfulness and shedding some light of what that means and what that practice looks like for our audience. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
As a reminder, both part one and part two of this Restore KC mindfulness programs will live in a podcast thanks to One Kansas City Radio. Both programs will also live on our Facebook page and also in our on our website at kansascitymuseum.org. That's kansascitymuseum.org. Until we meet up again in person, please continue to wear these face covers. Be safe out there and be kind to one another. Thank you and have a good night.